Religion is a big deal in America. Americans are very religious. The average American is more religious than the average Iranian, for example. And American has become more polarized in religious terms over the last half century. More Americans now than 50 years ago are very religious, and more Americans are very not religious. So we become more polarized, and also that your degree of religion now predicts how you vote, and that didn't used to be the case. So we're more extreme in our religious views. Americans turn out to be, our research shows, remarkably tolerant across religious lines. And so one key question the book asks is, how can we Americans be pretty tolerant across religious lines, even though we feel strongly about it and we're increasingly diverse? I happen to have been in Gainesville, where this guy, this preacher, first of all threatened to burn the Koran and then did burn the Koran. He's a kind of a nut, a weird guy. All the local religious figures, including all the local religious evangelical Christians, are sharply condemning what he, first of all, threatened to do and then what he did. He threatened to do it and got a lot of publicity, and the church membership of his church, which was then about 100, a large fraction of his own family, fell to about 30 people, almost all of whom are his own family. So this is a guy with a large family and seeking publicity. He doesn't represent anything. It's 30 people. After 9/11, there was a spike in community mindedness, a really steep upturn in community mindedness, as there is after every local catastrophe, always. After the floods in Queensland, there was, I know, a big spike in people's sense of connection in Queensland. The spike after 9/11 nationwide in America lasted about 6 months, not even, maybe 3 months, except among American young people. People who were caught in their impressionable years, people who were in school, elementary, secondary, university school in America at the time of 9/11, were permanently changed, and they became much more civically involved. That was the basis for Obamamania. Obama didn't cause that upsurge in young people's interest in public life. Test scores in schools measurably are lower where there's low social capital. People live longer. I mean, really live longer if they have better social connections. Crime rates are lower. Kids do better in places with high levels of social capital. So the evidence is that social capital does matter a lot. I mean, I'm sometimes teasing myself about saying that it fixes everything, but it really had levels of social connection and social trust have huge effects on our physical bodies, on the communities we live in, and so on. So it does matter. That was, in part, actually, it was a social capital problem, if I can put it that way. That is, it involved people violating their responsibilities, violating trust. That is, some people were trusted to know what they were doing and to act in a responsible way. I'm thinking really of bankers and financiers. We sort of trusted them to be, trustworthy, and many of them, it turns out, weren't, and that was an important part of the problem. But I don't think that was the only problem. I had been asked by a former student of mine who was working with a consulting firm if I would go and meet with Gaddafi to talk about his alleged plans for democratization. And I had worked on democracy, and so the idea was that I should talk with him about, some of our findings and how they might be relevant to political reform in Libya. It was a bizarre experience, actually. My wife and I were flown out to his tent in the desert. We were sitting there in the middle of the Libyan desert with some camels grazing in the background. In this tent, just the translator and Gaddafi and me and my wife and a note taker for about 2 hours, and he's written this sort of crazy book of political philosophy, which he calls the Green Book. And so his image of what we were doing is, I'd written a book on democratization, he'd written a book on democratization. There's these two great minds that are getting together in the desert to think about, you know, how to create a real democracy. I concluded within a couple of weeks after visiting him that this was probably mostly a PR exercise from his part, that he was probably not really interested in what advice I was offering. And so when I was invited back to talk with him a couple of weeks, maybe a month or two after the first visit, I declined. And I never actually wrote about the visit because I began to be suspicious that the purpose of the thing was not for me to offer advice to him, but implicitly for me to endorse him. And I certainly didn't want to do that, which is why I basically never said anything about the visit until really much later, when, you know, as the current crisis began to evolve, I then wrote an op-ed in the Wall Street Journal just describing this bizarre experience. I think now most observers agree it's going to be really complicated to put together any kind of serious democracy there, just because it's such a shattered society. It's not, the economy is actually not in that bad shape, but the society has really been shattered by this dictatorship over the last 40 years, and it's a terrible tragedy.